Alright, so this presentation we're going to go over the basics of one of the kingdoms of life that we don't really know a whole lot about still, and this kingdom of life is in the purple bubble in the middle of the diagram, the Protista. Even though the Protista, they're really unique and there's a lot of that we don't quite understand about them, their evolutionary importance is incredible. From the bubble diagram, you can see that we think that Protista gave rise not just to animals, but also to fungus and plants. So they're a hugely important category in the evolution of life on Earth, and let's go over some of their basics. So in general, here's a little collage of a few microscopic Protista. But in general, Protista are mostly aquatic, and I say mostly because there are some, when we get to the fungus-like Protista, there are some that do live on land, but for the most part, they're aquatic. You'll find them rivers, lakes, streams, some kind of body of water. Now, one thing that is true of all Protista is that they are eukaryotic. However, their cell it's eukaryotic, it has a nucleus. However, they may or may not be unicellular. Most of them are. Most of them are one-celled organisms. However, when we get to some of the plant-like Protista, you'll recognize kelp. Kelp is probably one of the more common Protistas. It can grow really large, hundreds of feet tall, therefore being multicellular. But most of them are unicellular. When it comes to reproduction, they're pretty adaptable. Some Protista can simply divide themselves in half, like you see in the picture here. Bacteria did this as well, binary fission. Other Protista will create little buds and kind of branch off little buds of itself, and others will actually join with a neighbor and exchange bits of DNA. So they're very diverse in pretty much everything that they do, including how they reproduce. When it comes to how they obtain their nutrition, again, they're really diverse. Most of them are heterotrophic, and by heterotrophic we mean again that they have to consume something. They have to, and so we're going to show you that some of these Protistas are actually very fierce predators. Now again, they're microscopic fierce predators hunting other microscopic organisms. Some, however, are autotrophic and can do photosynthesis. Some of them are decomposers. Now, decomposers are a type of heterotroph because they get their food from means other than photosynthesis. And some even are parasitic. They're parasites and they live off of a host. So there's a whole wide variety. And so because they vary so greatly, the analogy that's often made about Protista is they're kind of like the kitchen junk drawer. You know that one drawer in your kitchen. Everything else is organized except for that one drawer. The drawer next to it, organized. That's got the silverware in it. The drawer next to it, organized. That has office supplies in it. But we all have that one junk drawer. It's got some office supplies, but it's also got just a bunch of things in it that you can probably throw away. Batteries that don't work, mixed up with batteries that do work, a half-empty roll of tape, an empty roll of tape, broken pens, pen with no cap on it, a pencil with no eraser. We all have a junk drawer, and that's kind of the Protista right there, in that they don't quite fit. If we don't quite know what type of organism it is, let's throw it in the Protista category. So what we do know is that there are three main categories of Protista. We're going to go over those three in a little bit. The animal-like Protista that behave like animals, the plant-like Protista that, again, behave like plants, and the fungus-like that behave like fungus. So we're going to go over those starting with animal-like. So here we have a picture of an animal-like Protista. This is an amoeba. An amoeba is a very common animal-like Protista you may have seen before. But animal-like Protista are also called protozoans, also known as protozoans. And because they're animal-like, they have to be heterotrophs. There's no photosynthesis in the animal-like Protista. So animal-like are heterotrophs, and some of them are fierce predators, some of them are parasites, and because they live off of a host, they very well can even cause disease that would make them a pathogen. And so we classify these animal-like Protista into three subcategories based on how they move. And this is pretty straightforward once we start looking at the three categories. Well, since we have the picture of the amoeba up here, we might as well start with category number 1, the pseudopods. Now, pseudo is a prefix that means false or fake. Pods means foot. If you're a podiatrist, you work on the feet. So a pseudopod literally means they have a false foot. And so that's how these things move. The picture shows an amoeba, and amoebas don't really have any specific shape. They just look like a blob of cytoplasm. And when they're moving, it's kind of neat to see them move. When they move, their cytoplasm just oozes to the left, and then the rest of the cell flows into it. And then it'll change direction. It'll start oozing upward, and then the rest of the cytoplasm will flow into it. And then it might change directions and ooze to the left, and the rest of the cytoplasm will flow into it. And so every time it oozes, it branches out a little piece of cytoplasm. And in the picture, you can see that that is called a pseudopod. Amoebas are great examples of that. How they feed is by simply phagocytosis. Here we have a fairly simplistic animation of a cell swallowing a green square. And so this is an example of phagocytosis. Amoebas just kind of look like blobs of cytoplasm, and so they just slowly surround their victim, their prey. They swallow it up, and it's digested by enzymes. Here we have an animation of an amoeba swallowing up what looks like a paramecium, which we'll talk about in a moment. But notice how its cytoplasm just kind of branches out from various parts. These branching outs of the cytoplasm are its false feet. Those are its pseudopods. Another type of animal-like Protista are called flagellates. Well, based on their name, flagellates, you should be able to tell that they move with the help of a flagella. Here we have a flagellate known as Giardia, and you can see the flagella dangling down in this picture. Well, I put Giardia up there because actually Giardia is a fairly common intestinal problem that can cause diarrhea. If you ingest Giardia in contaminated water, well, the Giardia can grow and cause diarrhea. Another example of an animal-like Protista that moves with the help of a flagella is the bottom picture, the Trympanosoma. This thing lives inside of the gut of a tsetse fly. And so imagine spending your entire life inside the intestines of a fly. Well, pretty much your entire life inside the intestines of a fly. And so when a tsetse fly bites a human, it will inject this Trympanosoma into your blood, and that's kind of where the Trympanosoma divides, multiplies, reproduces, and then along comes another tsetse fly, bites a human, and sucks it back up. And they're able to carry out their life this way. But this can cause a disease known as sleeping sickness, which can actually be fatal. And if you're curious about sleeping sickness, go ahead and Google it. You'll find lots of good information about it. And then the third group of animal-like Protista are the ciliates. And because they're called ciliates, you should be able to imply that they move with the help of cilia. Here we have an animated picture of some cilia wiggling back and forth, and you can see that there are hundreds of them. So it's not like the flagellates. The flagellates may only have 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 flagella, but the ciliates have hundreds and hundreds of cilia, and they wiggle, and because there's so many of them, they're fairly quick. And because there's so many of them, they're pretty acrobatic. They can twist, they can turn, they can stop on a dime and quickly change directions. So here we have a picture of a more well-known ciliate known as paramecia. And notice going around the edges of this picture are tiny little extensions sticking out. These are the cilia. And so that's how they move. And these are the animal-like. They're animal-like because, again, they're heterotrophic. They can be predators as well. I already mentioned the tsetse fly causing sleeping sickness, but I also wanted to mention another one. And this is one that we saw the other day when we went over the notes on the immune system. This little parasite right here is called Plasmodium. It's an animal like Protista, and it can cause the disease called malaria. The vector, I just wanted to throw this word out there again because we talked about this in the immune system notes. The vector is what spreads a disease. So mosquitoes don't cause malaria. Plasmodium does. But the Plasmodium, this little parasite in the picture, lives inside of the mosquito, and when a mosquito bites a person, the mosquito injects the Plasmodium into the person. And so here we have a picture of that happening. A mosquito is biting a person and injects that Plasmodium into the person's blood. The Plasmodium will then migrate into your liver, where it will develop and grow, lay some eggs. And eventually the Plasmodium will reproduce and spread and start to kill off, use your red blood cells and start to reproduce with the help of your red blood cells and end up killing your red blood cells. Kind of similar to what a virus does. Remember how viruses cause cells to explode? That's kind of what you see happening in this picture. And now that your blood is teeming with this Plasmodium, along comes another mosquito, bites you, sucks up the Plasmodium, and then flies around and bites another person. So some of these protozoans can again cause disease. And these are some of the effects of malaria in humans. Fever, vomiting. Eventually a person can go into a coma and die if they're not given anti-malarial drugs. Let's change directions here and go into the plant-like Protista. Well, what makes them plant-like? I hope it's pretty obvious what makes them plant-like. First of all, these are also known as algae. So for those of you that might have a fish tank, you know all about algae. Every so often, you got this layer of green slime on your fish tank, and you got to clean the fish tank. But what makes them plant-like is the fact that they're photosynthetic. Now, how come we don't consider them real plants then? Well, real plants are multicellular, and plant-like Protista are, for the most part, unicellular. Plant-like Protista also don't have roots or leaves. And so for these reasons, we call Protista plant-like. We call algae plant-like. And so the different types of algae are classified by the kind of cell wall that they have and what their cell wall is made from. Now, we're not going to go into the components of the cell wall. We're just going to go over a few of the more common groups of plant-like Protista, starting with the Euglenoids. The Euglenoids, also called Euglena, these are kind of neat because they're kind of animal-like. They're animal-like in that they have a flagella and can swim around. They can even capture their own food. But they're plant-like in that they're green. They got chloroplasts in them, so therefore they do photosynthesis. So they're kind of interesting in that way, in that they're plant-like and animal-like. But because they do photosynthesis, we put them in the plant-like category and not the animal-like category. And here we have an animation of a euglenoid just swimming around. You can see at its back end that there's a flagella pushing it forward as it swims. But notice that the color green implies the presence of chlorophyll, so it's able to do photosynthesis. See that red spot at the front? It's got a red spot used to detect light. And so it will sense bright light and swim that direction, because if it swims into bright light, it's able to do photosynthesis better. Another category I want to mention of plant-like Protista are the Dinoflagellates, and I want to mention these because of their huge importance in the world of ecology. They have a huge role in ocean ecosystems. From the picture here, we have a food chain. Well, look at the base of the food chain. It says plant plankton. Well, it should say plant-like plankton, plant-like, because plankton aren't actually plants, but they're plant-like because they do photosynthesis. In the middle of the ocean, where there's no land, just open water for miles and miles and miles, we have thriving ecosystems in the middle of the ocean. Even though there's no plants to do photosynthesis, there's plant-like Protista to do photosynthesis, and these are the Dinoflagellates. They make up the basis of most ocean food chains and ecosystems. And so here they are. I mean, this is highly magnified right here. They're kind of creepy looking, but also in the same way, they're kind of just intriguing and beautiful to look at. So this is a picture of a dinoflagellate, and it's able to do photosynthesis and release oxygen. It's also part of the foundation of most ecosystems in the oceans. And the third group of plant-like Protista I want to mention are my favorite, the diatoms. They're my favorite because of just how geometrically pretty they are. These pictures that you see show some diatoms, and what's unique about them is that they have a glass-like shell that surrounds them. And so because of that shell, you can see that they just have these really incredible complex geometric patterns, and they're just really neat to look at. They're also, oh, there goes the bell right now, so that'll pass in just a moment. And so they are green and have chlorophyll and do photosynthesis. And actually, they're pretty much the kings of photosynthesis. They produce about 50%. They alone, the diatoms alone, produce about 50% of Earth's oxygen. And now, we typically think of plants as being the true masters of photosynthesis. But when you look at the diatoms alone, they make about half of Earth's oxygen through the process of photosynthesis. So I think these are really neat examples of plant-like protistas. So the next category I want to mention is the final one, the fungus-like protista. So what makes them fungus-like? Well, what makes them fungus-like is that they're decomposers. They absorb nutrients from whatever it is that they're growing on. If they're growing on, for instance, a fallen tree, well, they release enzymes and absorb nutrients directly from that fallen tree. So they're decomposers, very much like fungus are decomposers. And a few things that are interesting about them is they go through these different stages of their life. Their early stage, they release spores. The spores actually have little cilia on them, are able to swim around. So these things, even though they live on dry land, if their spores land in damp soil, the spores have cilia and can swim around a bit, and then eventually develop into some of the organisms that you see in the pictures. So there's two big categories of fungus-like protista I want to mention, and we're just going to mention a few brief facts. One category are called the slime molds, and that's what you see pictured here. The one on the bottom is a really neat example. This slime mold actually grows out and it pulses, almost like it has a heartbeat. And what's neat about it, like it says, it's a single cell. It's a single mass of cytoplasm. So this thing can grow rather large, and it's literally only one cell with a pulsating cytoplasm. And what makes it, again, fungus-like is that it's a decomposer, and animal-like in that it has spores on it that can swim around at an early stage. And the other category I want to mention are water molds. And water molds I want to mention because, like it says, it can be parasitic. But water molds I really want to mention because they have historical importance. They caused the disease known as potato blight, which was the main factor behind the Irish potato famine. So when the Irish potato famine hit in the 1800s, the Irish, the potato crops that they were growing became infected with a water mold. And you can see pictures of the infected potatoes, of what the potatoes look like when they're infected with this mold. And so the vast majority of poor lost their number one source of food, potatoes. And so there was mass starvation in Ireland at this time. And so this caused a lot of Irish to emigrate and move to other places in search of a better life, and this led to a mass immigration of Irish into the United States. So the potato blight has historical value in that it's parasitic, and it has a history with disease in humans. And I just wanted to throw this picture in here. I just thought it was a really powerful tribute. This is a tribute in Dublin. And again, it's a tribute going back to the Irish potato famine. And again, just so a way to remember that time in Ireland's history. And hopefully, try not to repeat the same acts. And so when we finish up with our notes on Protista, one reason why they're really important is in the world of evolution, again, they're so diverse, and what we see is a shift from unicellular life to multicellular life. And here's what we mean. Some Protista are single cell, and they live by themselves. Here we have a single-celled Euglena. It's got a flagella, it does photosynthesis, it can swim around. But we also see a shift. We also see Protista live in colonies. Here we have a group of cells called volvox. This is a group of Protista. But what's interesting is that this is not one big organism. This is made up of many organisms, all living as a colony. Now, what's interesting about this colony, it says there's no specialization. So it's not like one group of cells does one job, another group of cells does another job, another group of cells does another job. It's not like that. They're all independent acting. But they live in this multicellular arrangement. So what we're seeing is a transition of life from one cell to multicell. And finally, we see in Protista, we see multicellular life. Kelp is a great example. It can grow hundreds of feet tall, and kelp has cells that are specialized to do very specific jobs. So the evolutionary importance of Protista is really they are the ancestors to multicellular life, because when we look at the plants, the animals, and the fungus, they're all multicellular for the most part. There are a few one-celled fungus out there, but for the most part, plants, animals, and fungus are all multicellular. And we think they evolved from Protista, which are mostly unicellular. I say mostly because there looks like there's a transition from one-cell life to multicellular life when we study Protista. This might be a good place to pause the video if you want to do some review here. It's just a little flow chart kind of illustrating some of the major points that we talked about. So if you want to spend more time on this, hit the pause button, maybe jot it down, or at least hit the pause button and review it, because I'm going to move on. And here we are, we have the end. So the practice quiz, all of these questions the answers can be found in the video that we just watched. So hit the pause button and try to answer some of these questions. Jot the answers down on a separate piece of paper. I'd be happy to check your answers before or after class. So good luck, and I hope this was helpful.